Welcome everyone to Senate Education this Thursday afternoon, January 18th. We have with us Chair Samuelson and Sarah Buxton. Chair Samuelson, we know, is the chair of the State Board of Education. And Ms. Buxton, you are special counsel to the State Board of Education, correct?
That's correct.
Great, thanks. So what I thought we needed some time in committee to do, since it's in the press so much and we continue to have a number of different conversations and even questions from constituents and colleagues, is to go over the 2200 rule series. And if you don't mind, I think, unless I see some immediate questions, I'll just turn it over to the two of you to take us through what these are. They're talked about a lot, what's in them, and then we'll have some questions.
Great. And I think that's a really good way to frame it.
Okay, we'll interrupt with questions too. I think that's this committee, while it's fresh, people can jump in.
Thank you. It's good to be back again. I'm Jennifer Deck Samuelson. I'm the chair of the State Board of Education. Nice to see you all, although a little farther away this time. And I am joined today by Attorney Sarah Buxton, who's been retained by the board to assist us with updating Rule Series 2200 to incorporate the principles and goals of Act 1 of 2019. And before I jump into this, I just want to preface this with the general overview that the board takes our responsibilities very seriously, and we are absolutely committed to implementing strict anti-discrimination and inclusion requirements in all of Vermont schools, including our approved independent schools. We've taken enormous steps to achieve this aim through the last and current round of rulemaking, which I'm kind of referring to as phase 1 and phase 2, and I'll get into that shortly. The rules we are discussing today have the power of law. They're very strong rules. In fact, there are several parts of the rules, including the non-discrimination provisions, that are significantly more robust for approved independent schools than they are for public schools. And we can address that point at another time at the committee's pleasure, if you'd like. With my thanks to Morgan for his assistance, I sent to each of you this morning the following: the slideshow presentation, which I believe everyone has, as well as, and this is where it gets a little bit more lengthy, the current version of Rule Series 2200 that is fully effective as of July 1st of 2023, the proposed updates to Rule Series 2200 as they were filed with ICAR this past fall, and a detailed side-by-side that Sarah prepared so that it's clear what changes are being proposed. You can review the rule series and the side-by-side at your leisure, but we thought it would be helpful to have everything at your fingertips so that you understand the work that we've done and the work that we are continuing to do. These rules are comprehensive. They reflect many hours of work by board members and input from stakeholders, and we are proud of them. So with that, I'm going to jump to my first slide.
I would just say my only recommendation in all of this would be talk to the committee like we don't know much about rules or anything. I mean, I really want us all to have this, make the language our own after we have this conversation. So as much as you can do that, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I have a few slides that are sort of setting the table for our discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me just, jump to slide 2. I do want to point out after we met last week and I couldn't remember where our student members were from, I did update that just so that we're all clear. So our junior member, Gray Farron, is from Panton and he's a student member. He attends Virgins Union High School. Aaliyah Wilburn is our senior member and she attends North Country Union High School. The other update, which I have for you, which is unrelated to these rules, is this computer case of mine, which now you can't see anymore, is from Etsy. It would appear to be handmade. Don't have any more information on that, but I'm happy to give anyone the link who would like it.
Thank you, Ms. Samuelson. And are you going to be pulling the slides up on your side as well, or would you like to just say next? How would you like to do this?
Well, if members have the slides up, then that might be the easiest way. Otherwise, I can share my screen.
Oh, that's fine.
So I'm on slide 3.
Oh, there's a concern that people in the watching might not be able to see.
Got it.
Great point. So why don't you go ahead and pull them up if you don't mind?
Sure. Give me just a second.
If you enable my sharing, I don't mind sharing if Jen, you need to look at your screen.
Okay. This is going to be embarrassing. How, Sarah, what do I need
I
to
got
do?
it
Okay.
again.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Great. Thank you. So let me just go back to my version of it. Okay. So on slide 3, I just listed out who from the State Board of Education is on this Rule Series 2200 Update Committee. The committee has not changed from, phase 1, our last iteration of updates, to this current iteration of updates. So I am chairing it, and I'm joined by Kim Gleason and Tom Levitt. The next slide, slide 4, this series, this slide is really kind of setting the table, and I've got a few of these, but this really just kind of starts with what authority does the board have and what are the effect of our rules. So pursuant to 16 VSA 164.14, the board is required, this is mandatory, it's a shall in statute. We are required to adopt rules for the approval of independent schools. The rules are then adopted pursuant to Vermont's Administrative Procedure Act, and they have been codified as Rule Series 2200. As duly adopted administrative rules, these rules have the power of law. Compliance with them is not discretionary. And I think that's really important for the committee to understand. Next, this is another little place setting series of slides. This is slides 5, 6, and 7. These are the roles. And it's funny to me, Vermont is a small state, but yet we have both an agency of education and a board of education. And I've received a number of inquiries where people are really confused about, who does what, what is the purpose, what is the role of the board. So I wanted to take a minute and just really clarify that. I don't know if, the committee also has similar confusion, but I just thought it'd be helpful to lay it out here. So the board, you'll notice, based on the size of the font of this slide, we really have 3 basic roles. We adopt rules for approval. We make findings before we approve schools that meet the requirements of Title 16 and our rules upon recommendation of the secretary. And we conduct quasi-judicial due process hearings to revoke or suspend independent school approvals, again, upon recommendation of the secretary. The next 2 slides, slides 6 and 7, I'm not going to read these. I'm just going to, there's slide 6, or Sarah, and slide 7. You'll notice the font's much smaller. There are a lot more bullets. There are a lot more responsibilities that the agency is charged with. These roles are more varied and they're more extensive. The system that we have in Vermont is designed for each entity to perform specific functions that align with their structure. And this makes sense when you consider our resources. The state board is an independent board that's made up of essentially volunteers who bring various backgrounds and expertise in the educational field to our positions, but we all have other jobs, we have an extremely modest budget, and we have no staff. The agency, by contrast, is comprised of professionals whose duty it is to enforce and monitor compliance along with its many other duties. And as you can see in slides 6 and 7, this work is enormous. The agency is not sitting on its hands. It's not ignoring matters related to independent schools. Their work in this area is extremely time intensive and thorough. There are site visits, there's technical assistance, there's scrupulous review, and this all takes time. But, much as we want to reassure, the committee and members of the public that a school that is approved has been through an extensive process, any, assistance for an independent school, any, investigation of complaints with regard to an independent school is also similarly thorough so that the public can have confidence in our process. I'll also just take a moment here to foreshadow that in the newly proposed rules, we recognize that, there are a lot of tasks that are being assigned to the agency, and we are proposing to have an annual assurance for independent schools to complete that will just ease future backlogs by adopting some minor coordination checkpoints. So moving on, slide 8, this is now going to what I'm referring to as our phase 1 updates. So these were updates that were largely enacted in response to Act 173 of 2018. So there were, 2 sets of updates to phase 1. the first set of rules became effective upon adoption. So that was May 10th, 2022. And then the second set, which really, pertained to the Act 173 related changes, those only became effective July 1st of 2023. And that change involved rewriting Rule 2229 and adopting approval criteria for approved independent schools to receive public funds. So that was a pretty significant rewrite that we did there.
We have a question from Senator Hewitt.
Sure.
Oh, it's more of a comment, and I do this sometimes in health and welfare. Could we just slow down a little bit, because there's a lot of information coming at us at once.
Sure. So and I can pause too and see if there are any questions, or, if
That would
you're
be
just
great.
trying to
You just
check your
slow it
understanding.
down a little bit. That would be great. Whatever speed the committee's comfortable with.
Does anyone have questions at this point?
I actually have a question. What is the process as applications come into you? How are they vetted prior to arrival to the board by the AOE, or do they just come directly to the board?
That's a really good question. And there is a very extensive process, which is laid out in, well, the rule numeration has changed, but it starts with, if a school is up for reapproval, they have to submit a timely application packet. And that is in, I believe it's current Rule 2226. So it's very extensive what they need to submit. Once they have done that, the agency will conduct a site review, and the agency team that conducts the site review prepares a report. That report is vetted by agency counsel, and it is reviewed and signed by the secretary. At that point, with the secretary's recommendation, at that point, that recommendation comes before the State Board of Ed 2200 School Approval Committee, which is Tom Lovett, Jenna O'Farrell, and Lyle Jepson. So they meet with the agency, they meet with the school. They have, a question and answer if there are any questions. And I should say too, that this independent school is given an opportunity to respond to the secretary's recommendation. So they have a meeting, and then based on that meeting, the 2200 Approval Committee then presents its recommendation to the full board. And then that happens at our monthly meetings, where, Tom Lovett will present us with the entire packet, including the secretary's recommendation and the report from the agency team. We have a discussion. The school is there if board members have any questions, and then we vote on it.
May I just interrupt? You also are required to make findings, Jennifer. So I just wanted to highlight that, because that's those findings carry over into the next iteration.
Thanks.
So I guess that's just to say that I've pulled it up on the screen here. I'm not sure if you can see it, but the current rules, it starts in section 2226, and you can see there's a variety of things that are required in the application. But then in the approval process, the agency does all its work, as Jennifer said, the subcommittee does its work. But then in addition, the board has to make a number of findings that, are pretty robust. And then they can make their decision about whether a school is approved or not. And they can put conditions on the schools. I'm not sure if that's been done in recent times, but they can.
It has, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And when you say things like pretty robust, can you point us in that direction so we know what you're?
Yeah. Actually, I'm gonna point you in two places. One is where they are now, which is up on my screen. And then I'm going to pull up the new set of rules, because they've been reorganized a little bit for usability, but for another reason I'll get to in a second. So the robustness of the review starts here. I don't know, can you see my screen okay?
You want to make it a little larger, Sarah?
So this, what I'm looking at right now is section. Let's see if I can make it any larger. Screen. There we go.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
thank you.
So I'm looking at these are the current rules, Senator. Oops. So the current application requires, some basic information. And as you can see, those include the school's statement of philosophy and purpose, description of their enrollment practices. That I'll highlight is different for the application to receive public tuition under the current rules, and has been sort of reorganized under the proposed rules. The plan of organization, governance, faculty, student body, names and addresses of the governing board, description of curriculum, methods of instruction, evaluation procedures, special services, etc. And then I think one of the important parts that was added in the last update, which was phase 1 of 2200, is this part right here that I've got highlighted. And it says that the school needs to comply and provide, demonstration that the school substantially complies with all statutory requirements for approved independent schools and provides documentation of the following: a statement of non-discrimination posted on the school's website, and those are checked in the school's app and included in the school's application materials, that is consistent with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act and the Vermont Fair Employment Act. Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act. The assurance signed by the head of school that the school complies with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act in all aspects of the school's admissions and operations, and a description of the facilities and assurances that the facilities meet all applicable state and federal requirements. I'll skim through some of the rest because they're probably what you would typically think of that you'd be looking at with a school. Information about their staffing, their staff qualifications, the job descriptions, the resumes, the assignments of all the staff members, how the institution approaches professional growth of staff and supports professional development, and what they've done over the last 2 years. So it's both like, what is your policy, but then show us evidence of what has happened. More information about the professional environment. Financial capacity here is actually largely lifted from statute. The legislature adopted this many years ago, and certainly has always had an interest in making sure that approved schools are certainly not going to go under anytime soon. And then the second part of this, as I had said, it was robust, is that the agency is collecting all this information. They're doing their site visit. They're creating the report that Jennifer had mentioned. But then before the board, which sits in this sort of check and balance in the process, when the board acts, it goes over all of that homework that it's been presented with, considers the recommendation of the secretary, and then needs to make these findings prior to approval. Examples include the course of study is adequate. The school has the available support services to meet the requirements of the minimum course of study. Everything including library, administrative services, guidance and counseling, a system of records by which student progress may be assessed. All of the facilities information, that the school employs professional staff who are qualified by training and experience in the areas in which they are assigned. I think that's a really important part to note, because I think what that is intended to do is, we all acknowledge that the licensing requirement is not the same for independent schools, but that's not to say there is no consideration of professional accountability or professional status. This clearly asks the board to make that finding, that the professional staff are qualified by their training and experience, and for teachers that they have a minimum of a bachelor's degree in their field of instruction. More on professional staffing, that the school substantially complies with all the statutory requirements for approved independent schools, including non-discrimination. and other requirements that are in your are in Title 16 and actually Title 18 is the immunization of students against disease. That the school maintains their register of daily attendance. Again, operational matters, financial matters, that the school is in compliance with the Child Protection Registry and the Vulnerable Adult Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation Registry. A few years ago, I believe this bill may have originated in the Senate, or maybe it didn't, but you did update the law, and it's now in the rules that the school complies with legal requirements concerning non-discriminatory school branding.
Ms. Buxton, we have two questions. I think Senator Williams has a question and Senator Hewlett.
Well, my question was back in, Rule 2226, 2226, and, these standards that we're holding independent schools to, are the public schools being held to the same standard?
Do you want me to answer that, Jennifer, or would you like to
Sure.
answer that?
No, you can.
So, the public schools, and I don't have this up on my screen to show you, but it is something actually the board is really engaged in at this moment. The statute requires that the board establish education quality standards, and it notes what those education quality standards need to address. They aren't, I'll just say at an overall level, they don't, on the whole, they are not as detailed as this. They are general, but I don't know that I can say that they are more or less robust. They're just different. And I am actually doing some work for the board to try to compare and contrast some of the areas where these rules are the same and where they're different. For example, all schools need to have a hazing, harassment, and bullying policies, and all schools need to adhere to the immunization requirements. So there are many things that are the same requirements, but as you're seeing right now on my screen, the professional development and the professional support and the instructional strategies are different. Curriculum is decided in an independently governed board by the independently governed school by that entity, whereas the curriculum in a public school is determined at the supervisory union level. I don't think I quite answered your question. They're not exactly the same.
I'll take that as a no, but it's hard to see where we can have one standard for academic excellence if we're being held to different standards of compliance. So that was my point.
Yeah, you're a very good point. I will let you know that in Title 16, you do require the board to promulgate standards of performance, and those apply to public schools. But you also require them to approve assessments for those standards of performance, and the assessments, meaning the testing, those apply to both. And so there is data, and this is something you may want to follow up to find out what the data looks like and how that's presented. You may want to follow up with the agency, but to say that we don't have a handle on the performance of independent schools versus public schools in terms of academic excellence, what we do have the assessment data for how students are performing, and that's reported up through the secretary. I don't know if that helps.
Senator Hewlett.
Yes, I do have a question.
Thank you.
But I want to echo Senator Williams' great point that it is a shame that we have this bifurcated system with two separate levels of assessment and oversight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you for bringing that up, Senator Williams. I am wondering about, in terms of the financial viability piece, and I'm sorry if you said this, Sarah, and I missed it, but Do these items have to be published? So for example, like when you talk about finances, are you required to publish the finances of each school?
No, actually, in in Title 16, there are the public records exemptions for independent schools for select pieces of information. And I can get you that precise reference. But not all information is public record. I can't tell you that which documents are and which aren't, but I know that there are some exemptions. The tuition is not, the amount of the cost for tuition is something that's reported and tracked by the agency. But there isn't a publishing requirement at this time.
Okay, thank you.
So, and I will just, a couple of things to tack on to what Sarah's presented here. One is, just thinking back on approvals that the board has considered in the last, year or two. The question of qualification of staff, we declined to approve a school because we had concerns about the staff qualifications for at least one of the teachers. And there was another school that we considered where we were concerned about the financial viability. And, we have the authority to grant approval up to 5 years. I believe that school, we granted approval for 1 year because we wanted them to come back and, assure us that they were financially viable. So we do take the rules very seriously. And, it's not like we're rubber stamping either based on the secretary's recommendation or what's written in the rule. I mean, we really do go through these rather thoughtfully. The other thing I would say is these rules 2226 that Sarah just reviewed with you, that goes to a school's approval. So this is kind of like the first lever in the system. This is sort of, is a school going to be an approved independent school or is it going to be a recognized independent school? And if it wants to be an approved independent school, even before we get to the question about public tuition funds, it has to comply with 2226.
And I've just pulled up the new version, the proposed rules, which are 2/3 of the way through the Administrative Procedures Act, for rulemaking. And they're organized a little bit differently, and it may help this committee, or I'm hoping you're pleased with where the board went with this. Rather than categorizing the information as here's what you need to have in your your application package, and here's what the board needs to, the findings that the board needs to make. We've reorganized this slightly so that it's very clear that it's not that you have to provide evidence just for an application, that everything that the board has promulgated in these rules with regard to operation are actually requirements to operate. They're of course precursors to becoming approved, but they're requirements to operate. And so as you have the time to go through the proposed rules, you will see that they're significantly even more robust, not necessarily because the board added a lot of new things, but the board had asked me to go into the green books and pull out all of the requirements that are in there that apply to independent schools, and to include them in this as well. I thought I would just pause for a second and also note that the board bolstered again the non-discrimination requirements and the non-discrimination statement and policy, so that not only is some of this language familiar to you because we just went over it, but we also added that the agency will develop a standardized method to assess a school's compliance with this subsection, and it shall be used to investigate complaints of non-compliance, and it will be used when evaluating applications for approval by accredited and non-accredited schools. The method will provide indicators of compliance and shall be made available to schools for their ongoing self-assessment. The board thought this was really important because I think when we talk about compliance,
just a second,
You can finish her.
okay, go ahead and then Senator Buick has a question.
Sure. I think when there's monitoring around non-compliance, some board members were concerned about, without a standardized tool, that there may be subjectivity. And so they asked to have language in here that would create a tool so that it could be used and would sort of eliminate that subjectivity about compliance.
Okay, thank you. I believe there's at least one school right now that's not complying and is still being considered as an approved independent school. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. I believe it's the Grace Christian School.
So this goes back to my slide about the division of roles between the board and the agency. And that school has not come before the board for reapproval. So there's nothing pending before the board. That's something, that the agency has to go through its process of reviewing and then making the recommendation that would then come before the state board subcommittee before it comes before the full board.
Can you speak to why there seems to be a hiccup in that process? Why is there that complexity that is not sort of drawing a line in the sand?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Like, why has it not come before the state board? Or
sure. Why is it held up in the AOE? Because earlier I thought you said that applications that come to you aren't necessarily vetted by the AOE, that they come directly to you. So I'm confused.
No, I certainly didn't mean to communicate that if I did. An application for approval always goes to the agency first, because the agency has the staff that then conducts the site review, goes to the school, prepares the report. That report is then reviewed by agency legal counsel. It's reviewed by the secretary. The secretary then makes a recommendation. The school then has a chance to respond to the secretary's recommendation. All of that happens at the agency level before it ever comes to the board. And all I can tell you is it has not come before the board.
So it sounds, we were having a little bit of this conversation earlier today, that it's with the agency right now. If we have specific questions about moving this along, it lies with the agency.
Yes, and I mean, I don't even know where it is with the agency because, I mean, again, I'm not privy to that information. We only see a school when the agency has completed its review, and then it
No, I
comes.
appreciate that. It's good clarification. There's been some confusion out there, I think, whether it does lie with all of you or the agency. And so that part's very helpful.
Okay.
Senator Jewel-Chip?
No, thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So I think I believe on.
Oh, actually, if I may,
Sure.
can local districts, one of the things that I believe might be happening somewhere, can local districts decide not to send money to a certain school?
Again, my understanding is that there is a list that is made available on the agency's website of schools that have been approved. And so if a school is on the agency's website as approved, then that is the signal to local school districts that they are authorized to send tuition payments to that school.
But if they have concerns that a school is not following up on Senator Buell's question, the anti-discrimination piece, do they have the authority and the power themselves? Can a district say, hey, we're going to stop this now because it's not on the website, the attestation isn't there, that kind of thing?
So I don't believe that a district would have the power to unilaterally make that decision. They would have to go through the complaint process, which is again laid out in rule. And that's a pretty robust process, but it starts with someone making a complaint or a report that then goes to, and Sarah, I believe that's currently in 2220. Now I can't remember.
Yep, I can pull it up right here.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point because just to confirm what the chair said, it's true a local district The way the system works, the board makes the list. They approve all of the schools. If a school is on that list, then the district may, pays the tuition to that school. They can't subjectively pick and choose which schools on that list they want, they feel are, they feel like they want to send the funding to. If they do have concerns, and it was a situation you just noted, Senator Campion, that they feel that that the school isn't in compliance. Unlike public schools, independent schools have a fairly robust complaint and investigation process. And there's a couple of things that can happen in this regard. The complaint can happen, and the secretary must conduct an investigation. In this case, the secretary, as they go through this process, could remedy the situation. If it was, the form wasn't filled out and the school just needed to fill it out, they could say, you forgot, please complete this. Or if it's something more substantial, they can also put the school on probation while they pursue a formal investigation, which may lead to a recommendation to the board to revoke or suspend approval. Until the board goes through that due process hearing, which is required, we don't lose sight of the due process requirement here. Once that process has begun, the secretary can put them on probation, can move through the formal investigation process, and then as a result of that investigation can recommend to the board to immediately revoke or suspend the approval. And that, like, as I said, is unique to independent schools.
And I do follow for a second too. Could anyone in the state make a complaint, or do you have to be in the district? For example, if I were to review the schools right now and say to myself, gosh, I want to check all the schools in Vermont this weekend to see who may or may not be putting forward the legal anti-discrimination policy. And I noticed, oh gosh, there are 3. And I wrote a letter of complaint. Would that move things along then, logically, from the agency?
Yeah, there's no limitation in the rules as to who has standing to bring a complaint. It just says, but the process starts with a complaint. So I want to be really clear on that. And it's a complaint that is made to the secretary, and then the agency conducts the investigation. And once that investigation is, and again, like there's different, layers that the secretary has before it would come before the full board for our consideration.
Thank you, Senator Hewitt.
I think this might be my last question, but we'll see. I'd love to hear more about the layers you just mentioned, but we could do that some other time. What is the time frame by which a school that is blatantly flouting the rules here, by which they need to comply before they lose their approval status? So, because it seems to me as though a school could be potentially discriminating for years, ostensibly, and still be approved. So is there a time frame that's in this that's laid out?
That's a good question. And I think, right now we're kind of between 2 different sets of rules. So the way the rules are written, and I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, there is a requirement that a school has to timely request reapproval. So if a school's request is not timely, then they would have to go through the approval process all over again. But once I'm sorry?
I just timely, there's no, that's could be a year, that could be 5 years.
Timely in geologic terms or in human terms, or I mean, what are we talking about? Timely?
Sure. So if a school has been approved for 4 years, I believe within 6 months prior to the expiration of that 4-year approval, they would need to reapply for approval, or they would have to apply for reapproval. Maybe that's a better way to say it. So if they've been approved for, it wouldn't be more than 5 years, but could be 1 year, it could be 5 years. prior to the expiration of that approval period, the school needs to submit a complete application for reapproval. If they don't, they lose their approval status. If they do submit it in a timely fashion, they are approved until they're not approved. And I did not write that rule, but I can intuitively understand that you wouldn't want to penalize a school for the secretary's delay, or whether that's intentional or otherwise. You wouldn't want to let the secretary allow certain applications to lapse because for whatever the secretary is thinking. You wouldn't want to penalize a school. There's an expectation that the school has to submit a timely application for reapproval, but then it's in the secretary's hand. This gets us into the new version, the phase 2 that we were looking at, where we are, and Sarah's put it up on the screen. This is new proposed language. This is what the board is currently working on. This is an annual compliance assurance. And part of the reason why the board, took the initiative and put this into the rule was, at the request of the General Assembly. And so what this does is it says that by January 15th of every year, the school shall continue or shall attest to its continued compliance with the applicable requirements of the rule series, as well as state and federal law. And I just want to point out, the board had a discussion. We put in January 15th as the deadline, because if you think about, school starting in September, if we have that deadline set, 7 months prior to the beginning of the school year, that allows families to make decisions about, do they want their child to stay in that school? Do they need to find somewhere else to go? We didn't want to disrupt families on August 15th and, suddenly have everyone scrambling to find a school. So, and Sarah's highlighting language in here that this annual compliance assurance form would contain. And there's also a process that this is what happens if a school does not timely submit it. So, the first step is that the secretary would reach out to the school and say, hey, you haven't submitted your form on time, you need to get that in. If the school still doesn't, then the secretary shall launch an investigation.
Senator Hashim.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could tell me how many schools in total are out of compliance with the rules, the 2200 rules?
I don't know of any. There aren't any that have come before the board. So, again, it would start with the complaint that would then go to the agency.
Yeah, the agency is also required to, in the current version of the rules, is required to maintain records of complaints in schools that they put on probation. So you can ask for that. That is a new requirement with the current rules. It's in place, but they are required now to collect that data. I also just wanted to make sure we put a fine point on the senator's earlier question about how long can a school be out of compliance. Right now, under current rules, as the chair said, 4.5 years until they have to prepare information. But maybe by July, if these rules make it through and over the promulgation point by July, it will not be that long. This attestation or this annual assurance is really important. And it does two things. One, it tightens that time frame to say annually, there needs to be a check on whether or not compliance is still in place. And if that's not found to be satisfactory, remember, Chair Campion, earlier you said, can anybody, launch an investigation or launch a complaint? That is true. However, the board opted in this instance that if that assurance process, if the school is failing to meet that assurance requirement, the secretary shall launch the investigation. So it immediately begins that process where formal investigation could result with revocation, and it just speeds up that process a lot faster, so that you don't have
Sarah,
that.
just if I may just follow that point, in that shall, in terms of investigation, could the secretary also at that point immediately put the school on probation?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
and does that halt public funding going to that school when it's on probation?
It doesn't halt public funding because that requires a due process hearing before before. But it does accept, and that's the constitutional consideration we're sort of juggling here. But it does mean that this is going to be addressed right away. The other reason for it is there are requirements about disrupting the student. Students, if you were to all of a sudden say students can't go to that school on Tuesday, they could on Monday. Part of the due process requires, their interests as well.
Senator Hashim.
So sorry to be repetitive with this question. I just want to make sure I confirm that currently all approved independent schools in Vermont that are receiving public dollars, all of them are abiding by every 2200 rule, right?
I think you can't answer it that they are, in the same way that you can't say that all public schools are complying with all of the educational quality standards. So I don't know, Jennifer, if you have more to say in that, because I think you had already said that you didn't have the complaints, but.
Yeah, like there are no complaints pending before the board. So I think, we have a system of checks and balances that have been set up. The board has very, clearly delineated roles. The agency has very clearly delineated roles. And, we have crafted these rules. The rules are effective, but, if a member of the public has concerns about a school, the proper process then is to file a complaint or report with the secretary.
Could I just ask, if this happens also in a public school, if there is a concern that somebody's being discriminated against, did you say, and I just want to make sure I have this, there's no process for public schools complaint processes?
Kind of what's come to light with the two committees I'm working with in the board. One is handling the education quality standards and the other is working on the 2200, is that the independent school rules are far more robust. They have that complaint process in there. The EQS.
No, I understand that. I'm just wondering about the kid who might be in public school.
Yeah. So there isn't anything in EQS that has that yet. There are mechanisms already available. I'm aware of special education complaints that the agency is federally required to take complaints related to special education. But I think the agency may be able to describe any other complaints and how they follow up on those in public schools. But they are very specific in independent schools and not so in the public schools.
And I'll just add to that too. I mean, if there were a complaint that were filed, that the agency investigated and then, referred to the board for a due process hearing, and let's say that the board, took the agency's recommendation and revoked a school's approval status. That goes right to the heart of a school. We've now demoted that school from an approved independent school to a recognized independent school. If it's an approved independent school that is receiving public funds, it is no longer receiving public funds. There's no corollary with the public school system. There might be a complaint, and there might be a finding of wrongdoing, but that wouldn't take away the ability of the public school to receive public funds or, continue to operate as a practical matter.
And the reason I asked, there were some headlines this summer, I think, about some different students that were being discriminated against. And I'm not seeing, as perhaps one of the things we could work on is putting something in place for those students as well. Yes, Senator Go.
Well, I just want to say, because I've been through this, that there's a district in my area that was found to be discriminating against a student, and it went up to the federal level. And they were literally under investigation and had to comply with certain rules for a number of years before they were released from that lawsuit. So
Just cool.
yeah, I think it felt very robust. I just want to say that much for what it's worth.
It sounds like you had to go through the court system.
Well,
Yeah.
and then they had to follow a bunch of rules to get sort of out of that.
And it sounds like this,
Wrangling.
they could maybe, if we created something, they might not have to go all the way through the system
Okay,
and get lawyers and that kind of thing.
My question was, do you have a list of public schools that are not following EQS?
Again, no, nothing like that has ever come before the board. So I don't even have an answer to the question of, are there public schools that are not complying with EQS?
Okay, well, because someone was speculating that a few minutes ago. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, it's the secretary's duty to make that determination. The reason I raised that is when the question was asked, how many are out of compliance? The monitoring of Vermont's education system at no level makes this check of you're either in this box or in this box. And so it's based on the complaints at this point. And at least with the independent schools, they at least have to go through a 5-year, they have to be up for review every 5 years.
Or less.
Or less, yep, if they're conditioned to say less. And so I guess the question was framed in a way that it isn't possible to answer, because that's not the way that compliance is implemented for education for schools in the state.
That's a better answer to me than speculating that there are a bunch of schools that aren't complying with EQS. Just FYI from my perspective.
Yep. Yeah, I apologize. I didn't mean to suggest that they weren't. If there were schools that weren't complying with EQS, you wouldn't necessarily know that either, unless there are allegations that might come out in a lawsuit.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we want to continue. We don't have a lot of time.
Right.
Have you back, but this has been very useful, and I think for me at least, it means we really need the Agency of Education in to ask the same kinds of questions of them. Since you're reading for, in my opinion, a lot of their work.
Well, and again, I think it's really helpful to go back to the slides that really delineate the roles between the agency and the board. And I think, with good reason, people don't necessarily understand, how the roles between the two entities are divided. And certainly we need to continue to work on dividing these roles and responsibilities. But I think, these slides really capture what the process looks like, between the agency and the board. And the board's roles here are pretty straightforward and pretty simple.
And that the agency has a lot of work on its plate with regard, to go through what the board has asked in these rules for them to do is extremely time intensive if it's done well, and they do a good job. And I don't think they have, 2 staff people maybe in that division. So it's a heavy lift, and I think that's worth noting.
I understand that
Yeah.
I understand that the AOE has a lot on their plate, but when it comes to discriminating against children, I think that should be bubbled up to the top of the list.
And we'll have the agency in next week for a similar conversation.
All right. So should we stop there? I wasn't really sure what the committee wanted. I can keep going, or we can.
Are there any other key highlights before we shift to Act 127 that you think we should know at this point?
Let me just.
And frankly, I would welcome you to not come back in when the agency's in, but watch the agency's testimony, one or both of you, to see if you want to. There's a chance to respond, or maybe we do have you both back.
Okay. Let me just point out, I am looking at slides, 9 and 10 and the current non-discrimination requirements. These are rules that are currently in place, and in particular, Rule 2229. That's the rule, the next lever. Now we're talking about an approved school, but in order to receive public funds, the school also has to comply with 2229. So I would encourage the committee to, take a good look at that, because that too is pretty detailed in terms of the requirements. And then, we are currently working on applying the principles and goals of Act 1 of 2019 to independent schools. And I think the one thing that's really noteworthy there that I would just, maybe leave the committee with is we have not heard from a single independent school, complaining about applying Act 1 to independent schools. In fact, what we got a lot of were schools reaching out to the board to say, this is great, we're already doing this work, we appreciate having this requirement in the rules, thank you. So we didn't hear any complaints from independent schools, suggesting otherwise. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
I just want to leave you with one thought, which is one that we hear in all of our committees in this building, which is that rules are only as good as their enforcement.
Right. And I
That's why we really, I mean, where I'm sitting, it's gotta have the agency in to talk about this, and I think we all might agree, it's part of a larger question in terms of how many people are in the agency to do all this work. And one of the things that would be interesting to know is, do they have, for example, who's their point person on this? Do they have somebody, or is this something else just the Carol's does, honestly, in addition to everything else, go around and check the anti-discrimination?
And I think the annual assurance will go a long way toward facilitating that. That is a new requirement. It is not currently in the rule. And so that's work that the board is, undertaking to close that loophole so that there will be this annual feedback from schools to the agency. Again, with this provision where if a school doesn't submit it, then that would not instantly, but it would launch the formal investigation process.
Along with a standardized, non-objective way of assessing whether or not, you're discriminating. That rubric and that tool is going to be really important, both to independent schools and recognized schools and public schools. Anyone who wants to use it, you would assume, non-discrimination is non-discrimination and the laws apply equally.
Thank you both.
Thank
I
you.
wonder if senators have specific questions for you, you're both available?
Sure.
Okay, and if it seems that the committee wants to have you both back when we have the agency next week or at a different time, we will be in touch.
All right. Thank you all. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Morgan, let's take 5 minutes before we shift gears.
Yeah.